The mob boss looked at Dean Martin and said, "You sing for us tonight or you die tomorrow." Dean's response became the most legendary moment in Vegas history. It was September 18th, 1965, backstage at the Copa Room in the Sands Hotel. Las Vegas was a different world than a desert oasis, where the rules were written by men in expensive suits who carried guns and settled disputes with violence. The glittering facade of the Strip masked a reality where organized crime controlled every major casino, every headline performer, and every dollar that changed hands in the neon-lit paradise they had built in the Nevada desert. Dean Martin had just finished the first show of his 3-week residency, a performance that had brought the house down with his effortless charm, and that voice that made even the toughest guys in the audience forget their troubles. But as Dean loosened his tie and reached for a towel to wipe the sweat from his face, he realized he wasn't alone in his dressing room. 3 men in dark suits stood near the door, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere from post-show relaxation to something much more dangerous. These weren't fans looking for autographs or casino executives wanting to discuss business. These were the kind of men whose job descriptions included words like enforcement and collection, and their cold stares made it clear they weren't there to congratulate Dean on his performance. The man in the middle, a stocky Italian-American with silver hair and dead eyes, was Vincent "The Fish" Torino, one of the most feared enforcers in the Chicago outfit's Las Vegas operation. Torino had earned his nickname not because of any connection to aquatic life, but because of his habit of making people sleep with the fishes when they failed to cooperate with his employer's requests. "Mr. Martin," Torino said in a voice that carried the kind of quiet menace that made smart people very nervous, "we need to have a conversation." Dean studied the 3 men for a moment, his face showing no emotion. He'd been in show business long enough to encounter all kinds of dangerous people, and he'd learned that the key to dealing with threats was to stay calm and think clearly. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Dean asked, his voice carrying its usual casual tone despite the obvious tension in the room. Torino stepped forward, close enough that Dean could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the lingering scent of cigarette smoke and something else. The metallic smell that seemed to follow men who were comfortable with violence. "You can do exactly what we tell you to do," Torino replied. "My employers have a special request for tomorrow night's show." Dean waited for Torino to continue, but the enforcer seemed to be enjoying the psychological pressure of making Dean ask for details. "What kind of request?" Dean finally asked. Torino smiled, but there was nothing warm or friendly about it. "Tomorrow night you're going to have some special guests in the audience. Important people who've traveled a long way to hear you perform. They want you to dedicate your entire show to them. They want you to mention their names, thank them for their generosity, and make sure everyone in the audience knows how much you appreciate their friendship." Dean understood immediately what was being asked of him. This wasn't about entertainment, it was about legitimacy. The mob bosses wanted to use Dean's fame and respectability to present themselves as legitimate businessmen rather than the criminals they actually were. By having Dean Martin publicly acknowledge them and thank them, they would gain a kind of social acceptance that their money and violence alone couldn't buy. "And if I'm not comfortable with that arrangement?" Dean asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Torino's 2 companions moved slightly closer, their hands drifting toward the bulges in their jackets that clearly weren't wallets. "Mr. Martin," Torino said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining something to a particularly slow student, "I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't a request. This isn't a negotiation. This is me telling you what's going to happen tomorrow night." Torino walked over to Dean's dressing room mirror and straightened his tie, as if he were simply having a casual conversation about the weather. "You see, Dean, can I call you Dean? Las Vegas has been very good to you. You make a lot of money here. You have a lot of fans here. You've built a very nice life here. But all of that exists because certain people allow it to exist. And those same people can make it all disappear very, very quickly." Dean felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Are you threatening me?" Torino turned back from the mirror and looked at Dean with the expression of a man who was genuinely surprised by the question. "Threatening you? Dean, I'm educating you. I'm helping you understand how things work in this town. You perform for people who pay to see you. Tomorrow night some very important people are paying to see you. and they want a little extra acknowledgement for their support. That's all. And if I refuse? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Torino's expression shifted from mock friendliness to something much more sinister. Dean, Torino said slowly, let me explain something to you. In this town, entertainers who don't show proper respect to the people who make their careers possible tend to have very short careers. Sometimes they have accidents. Sometimes they just disappear. Sometimes they're found in the desert with interesting new holes in their heads. Dean felt his blood pressure rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. He'd dealt with bullies his entire life, from the neighborhood tough guys in Steubenville, Ohio, to the studio executives in Hollywood who thought they owned him. But this was different. These men weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were threatening his life. So let me make this very clear for you, Torino continued. Tomorrow night, you dedicate your show to Mr. Antonio Benedetto and his associates. You thank them publicly for their support. You make them look like respected businessmen instead of what they actually are. And you do it with that famous Dean Martin charm that everyone loves so much. Torino stepped closer to Dean, close enough that Dean could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Or you don't wake up the day after tomorrow. It's really that simple. The dressing room fell silent, except for the muffled sounds of the casino beyond the walls, the ringing of slot machines, the cheers from the craps tables, the orchestrated chaos of a place designed to separate people from their money. Dean looked at each of the three men, measuring them, calculating his options. Then Dean Martin did something that no one in that room expected. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a frightened laugh, but a genuine amused chuckle that seemed to come from some deep well of confidence that intimidation couldn't reach. You know what, Vincent? Dean said, using Torino's first name with casual familiarity that clearly surprised the enforcer. I appreciate you coming here to explain the situation to me. I really do. It shows a level of courtesy that I wasn't expecting. Torino's eyes narrowed. This wasn't going the way these conversations usually went. Most people, when faced with the choice between cooperation and death, chose cooperation very quickly. But here's the thing, Dean continued, his voice taking on that relaxed conversational tone that had made him famous. I've been performing for audiences my whole life, and I've learned something important about respect. Real respect can't be bought, and it sure can't be forced. It has to be earned. Dean walked over to his dressing room chair and sat down, as if he were simply having a friendly chat with some old buddies who had stopped by to say hello. Now, I understand that you gentlemen are used to people doing what you tell them to do. I'm sure that approach works very well in most of your business dealings. But see, I've got a problem with your request. Torino's hand moved toward his jacket, but Dean held up a finger, as if asking for just a moment more to explain his position. The problem is this: tomorrow night, there are going to be 800 people in that audience who paid their hard-earned money to see Dean Martin perform. They're not there to see me endorse anyone or legitimize anyone's business activities. They're there to be entertained, to forget their troubles for a couple of hours, to hear some songs, and maybe laugh a little. Dean's voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made it clear he was building towards something important. Those 800 people deserve to get what they paid for. They deserve a show that's about them, not about making some criminals look respectable. And I'll be damned if I'm going to cheat them out of that, just because some tough guys think they can scare me. The silence that followed Dean's words was profound. Torino stared at him with disbelief, as if Dean had just announced his intention to fly to the moon. Are you out of your mind? Torino asked quietly. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Do you understand what we're capable of? Dean nodded thoughtfully. I understand exactly who you are and what you're capable of. You're Vincent Torino. You work for the Chicago outfit, and you've killed at least a dozen people that the FBI knows about. You're dangerous, you're connected, and you're used to getting your way through fear and violence. Torino's face showed genuine surprise. Most people didn't research the men who threatened them. But here's what I think you don't understand, Dean continued. I'm Dean Martin. I've sold 50 million records. I've starred in 40 movies, and I've performed for presidents and kings. I've built my career on one simple principle. I give audiences what they deserve, not what someone else wants them to hear. Dean stood up and walked toward the three men, showing no fear despite the obvious danger. So here's my counteroffer, Vincent. You and your bosses can go find some other entertainer to be your puppet. Someone who's more interested in staying alive than staying honest. But you're not gonna find that person in this dressing room. Torino's face was turning red with anger and disbelief. You're signing your own death warrant, Martin. Dean shrugged with that characteristic casual gesture that had become his trademark. Maybe. But I'd rather die as Dean Martin than live as Vincent Torino's ventriloquist dummy. Then Dean Martin said the 4 words that would become legend in Las Vegas history. Now get out, all of you. The words were spoken quietly, without anger or bravado, but with such absolute finality that they seemed to fill the entire dressing room. For a moment, nobody moved. The 3 enforcers stood frozen, unsure how to respond to someone who had just dismissed them as casually as he might dismiss a room service waiter. Torino's hand moved toward his gun, but then something unexpected happened. Dean's dressing room door opened, and Tom Jones, the Welsh singer who was performing in the lounge, stuck his head in. Dean, mate, fantastic show tonight. You coming to the bar for a drink? Tom stopped mid-sentence when he saw the 3 intimidating strangers in the room. Oh, sorry, didn't realize you had company. But Tom didn't leave. Instead, he stepped fully into the room, followed by 2 other performers who had been walking with him. Suddenly, Dean wasn't alone with 3 dangerous men. He was surrounded by witnesses, people who would notice if something happened to him. Torino realized that the situation had changed. Killing Dean Martin in his dressing room in front of witnesses wasn't an option, and the longer they stayed, the more people might see them there. This isn't over, Martin, Torino said quietly. Yes, it is, Dean replied firmly. It's completely over. Torino and his men left the dressing room, but everyone knew this was far from finished. Over the next 24 hours, word of Dean's confrontation with the mob spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. Other entertainers, casino employees, and even some of the less dangerous criminals began talking about the singer who had told Vincent Torino to get lost. The next night, Dean Martin took the stage at the Sands for what many people expected might be his final performance. The audience was packed, not just with regular fans, but with people who had heard rumors about the confrontation and wanted to see what would happen. Dean performed his regular show without any acknowledgement of mob bosses or special guests. He sang his hits, told his jokes, and entertained the audience exactly as he always did. It was, by all accounts, one of the best performances of his career. But the real drama happened after the show. As Dean was leaving the theater, he found Vincent Torino waiting for him in the hallway. This time, Torino was alone. You've got guts, Martin, Torino said. Stupid guts, but guts. Dean stopped and looked at the enforcer. Vincent, what are you doing here? I'm here to tell you something, Torino replied. My bosses aren't happy about last night. They're not used to being told no, especially not by entertainers. Dean braced himself for whatever was coming next. But Torino continued, they're also not stupid. Killing Dean Martin would bring more heat than they want to deal with. The FBI, the newspapers, the other entertainers, it would be a mess. Dean nodded, but didn't say anything. So here's what's going to happen, Torino said. You're going to keep performing here, and we're going to leave you alone. But this protection doesn't extend to anyone else. You help other performers stand up to us. You interfere with our business. You cause us any more problems, and the deal is off. Dean considered this for a moment. It wasn't complete victory, but it was survival, and it established something that hadn't existed before, the precedent that entertainers didn't have to be afraid of the mob if they were brave enough to stand up for themselves. I can live with that, Dean said. Torino nodded and started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. Martin, he said, for what it's worth, I respect what you did. Most people would have folded like a cheap suit. Most people aren't Dean Martin, Dean replied with a slight smile. Within months, the story of Dean Martin's confrontation with the mob had become legend throughout Las Vegas and Hollywood. Other performers began finding the courage to resist mob demands, knowing that it was possible to survive such confrontations. The absolute power that organized crime had held over Las Vegas entertainment began to crack. Dean's 4 words, now get out, all of you, became a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been intimidated by bullies, whether they were mobsters or just everyday tyrants who used fear to control others. The incident also marked the beginning of a gradual shift in Las Vegas power dynamics. As federal investigations intensified and legitimate corporations began investing in casinos, the mob's stranglehold on the city slowly began to loosen. Years later, when Las Vegas had transformed from a mob-controlled gambling town into a legitimate entertainment destination, many people credited Dean Martin's courage in 1965 as one of the turning points in that transformation. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about his confrontation with Vincent Torino, maintaining his characteristic modesty about his role in changing Las Vegas history. But those who knew him well understood that his refusal to be intimidated came from the same place as his refusal to compromise his artistic integrity, a deep belief that some things are more important than personal safety. The story serves as a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to do what's right despite being afraid. Sometimes when faced with the choice between survival and integrity, the most dangerous response is also the most heroic one, and sometimes, 4 simple words spoken with absolute conviction can change the course of history. If this story of standing up to intimidation moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage against overwhelming odds. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to bully you into compromising your principles? Share your experience in the comments below, and remember to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it mattered most.